All right, I think we're here, fam. So, anyone that's listening right now, just give me the thumbs up like we hear you. All right, that's great. We're already having that happen. Perfect. Hey, everybody on Instagram. The first person who just joined, can you hear me right now? Just let me know here on Instagram Live. All y'all joining, one person say that you hear me. So I know you hear me. Hey, right now, fam, anybody on the Instagram Live, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. So, folks, we're on Instagram Live, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn. Thank you for hearing me. But I love my Instagram family. So, after tell me what I could do better, support me getting better equipment. Because right now, one of my heroes and someone who has believed in me in 25 years, we're about to kick it. So, and I love that. Let's do it. Hey, Robin, can you hear us?
I could hear you, and it's so funny you took the words out of my mouth because
Well,
you're one of my heroes.
no.
When we first met, I was so starstruck. I didn't know what to do. I mean, you're Rosa Clemente.
Yeah, but you invited me to speak at Columbia University because you're Robin DJ Kelly. Like you,
Something like that.
I know. Well, no, listen, fam, we're in some crazy times, as we know. I'm doing this backup on Instagram Live. Look, honestly, also because he's been an inspiration to me around history. And that's been my love. And I love history. I don't think everything has to wait for 50 years. I think we live in contemporary times,
Hmm.
So let me give you just some facts and we're going to get into it. Robin DJ Kelly explores the history of social movements in the United States, the African diaspora, and Africa. Black intellectuals, music and visual culture, surrealism, Marxism, among other things. I'm not going to list his essays or
Yeah.
books because we would be here till tomorrow. And listen, honestly, I don't really. You can look at all the facts.
Right.
You know, um, what's happening this past year, I kind of always say to me, honestly, like, first, what would Dr. Turner and Dr. Bracy tell me? Because right now, folks, just so y'all know, I come out of Black studies. From an undergraduate to here, it's never Latino studies, Chicano studies. They never want me. I don't get invited to the Latino things. I learned that really from the beginning of my political life within the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And that's just the reality. Africana, Pan African studies, Black scholars have always embraced me. So that's my home, 100%. So, I'm young and I'm beginning to get in it. And then I see the work that Robin is doing. And then one time I get an email like, can you come to Columbia and talk? And I was like, oh my God, yes. Um, but when we talk about integrity and values at this moment, there's only a few of us who are sticking to those values. So, Robin, right now, right, we got the DNC is beginning. We have
Hmm.
a historical nomination for real, a Black Indian woman. How do you see what's going on around the Democrats and the electoral politics at this moment for our people?
Well, that's a good question because it seems like things are changing every hour, let alone every day. Um, you're right to say this is historic, and it was a little bit unexpected. I mean, at least for me. Um, and historic both in terms of this may be Kamala Harris may be the first female Black South Asian, just non-white, besides Obama, president of the United States. But she also comes with a lot of baggage. I mean, we have spent a decade or more fighting Kamala Harris on lots of different things, especially here in California when she was state's attorney. And, but under the circumstances, it's such an improvement, again, not that you have to believe in electoral politics as the answer or the Democratic Party, but under the circumstances, it looks like we may have a little bit more wiggle room um, to continue and to actually, we won't stop fascism. Fascism is going to be rolling along, but we can certainly create the conditions for space as we fight fascism. I mean, that's the way I see it. But again, it's we can't. My fear is that we do what we did with Obama. I shouldn't say we, not all of us did this, but declare victory. Say this is the ultimate victory, and therefore we must withhold any criticism of the new regime because of the symbolic politics of what does it mean to criticize a black woman in power and all that stuff. That has to go out the window because, if anything, we have to remember that it was under the Obama administration that Black Lives Matter, that the intense struggle against police violence, the killing of Eric Garner, Mike Brown, and Tanisha Anderson, all these things happened under a Democratic, specifically historic Democratic administration, Obama. So it's not like it's going to be different. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, because you said that wiggle room, right? Like, I mean, it just goes back right now. It's just breaking down to like evil and evil. But I think if he doesn't get elected, his his ideas are going to live longer than him.
Mhm.
That's what you're basically right. Like
Right.
we are already in a fascist state. There's no way we can't say that. Like especially those of us in academic spaces, movement spaces. Like there's no way. Well, nobody should be like we're not in a fascist time. We are because
Right.
that's what fashion does. It doesn't at the end need one person. It's already
Right.
gets ingrained in the followers and what that looks like. So as someone that's on a third party, I also recognize the significant um, things that Vice President Harris is saying right now. A lot of good things, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we're coming from a space of this dude to this woman, right? Like,
Right.
but it is remarkably like it's different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the social movements right now, especially the uncommitted movement, folks around Palestine, Gaza, young people are going to be coming, they're already returning to their campuses, their universities, like they're not stopping,
Right.
which is a good thing,
Right.
especially
Exactly.
at this moment. So at least
Right.
people are clear about that. But I also, I mean, I said the word movement, but I kind of feel like not a couple weeks ago, 6 days ago was the 10-year commemoration of Mike Brown.
Mm-hmm.
And personally, I have make sure I connected to those frontline warriors. But we also know that 6 of those warriors also were killed under
Right.
suspicious circumstances. Joshua Williams from Ferguson is still in jail. Like the cops aren't in jail and all of this. But I think 2 things happened with that. I don't think, I know that they were abandoned by what people call the larger movement. Like
Mm-hmm.
there are professors now and endowments and fellowships and grants to study Ferguson, while right now they're trying to pay their rent as those frontline organizers because they're also in a community where the police and everybody knows who they are. And second,
Right.
them taking out Corey Bush.
Mm-hmm.
I For folks that don't know, about 6 weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, Jamal Bowman, who was a representative in New York State that included this county called Westchester from the Bronx, that's where I actually grew up, he was taken out by AIPAC with 8 million. But they spent $11 million to take out Corey Bush. So the question we need to be asking is why is this AIPAC or any of these PACs that are steeped in Christian white nation supremacy spending this type of money to take one person out? That's exactly what they're doing because they're being very methodical. So, it's a 10th year. You've seen what happened to Jamal Bowen. You see what just happened
Mm-hmm.
with Corey Bush. Just as an analyst, I want to have you Do you think this is going to happen again, where APAC just keeps taking out anybody that is called progressive or left?
They're going to try. Let me. You raise a lot of issues. Let me go back to the first one, which I think I don't want to leave behind, and that does have to do with uh, the importance of a third party. Because one of the things that frustrates me all the time is this idea that, oh, well, you can't have a third party because you might undermine the balance of power. The whole point of a third party
Is to
is
do
to
that.
push. It's like, how could people not understand this? We have to have to. And the thing is, we don't want to have to deal with, we have a third party. And I have to say, I'm, I'm very supportive of the progressive politics. Cornell, there's a lot of people who are pushing for positions that if they were able to be elected, I'd elect them in a second, in a split second,
Yeah.
because it just, in basic principle, the policies are so much better and so much more attuned to the needs of the people. And for that reason, that's all the more reason to support whether it's uncommitted, third party, critical stance toward the so-called candidate, because we don't owe the Democratic Party anything, you know? I mean, the idea is that they need to represent, whatever party's in power needs to represent the interests of of the people, and that's the whole point of representative democracy, which is not as good as direct democracy, but that's another conversation. So I want to say that because that actually leads us to this question of money, Zionism, and electoral politics in the United States. They spent so much money to defeat Jamal Bowman, who comes out of hip hop, he comes out of community. He has, he actually came a distance in terms of his position on Palestine.
Exactly. Yeah.
He and many of us, myself included, were involved in those conversations with him, and he studied the question, he learned, and then he took a principled stance. And the principled stance that he took, which is a principled stance that Reverend Cori Bush took, you know, from a principled and ethical and moral stance, is that we do not want genocide anywhere. And we, for damn sure, don't want to fund genocide. And it's a basic violation of this thing called the, UN Convention on Genocide from 1948. It's a violation of international law. And that's just one violation. So why should we, as moral and ethical human beings who care about humanity, it doesn't matter, even if you take race, if you take class, if you take politics, ideology out of it, just as human beings, who wouldn't want to support that? Why would it be ethical for any organization to spend money to defend genocidal war? Because that's what AIPAC does. I mean, that's their basic focus is we're going to defend Israel and its policies and the continuation of U.S. massive investments, sales, and gifts to Israel to wage this basically unilateral, unequal war on people who've been trapped in essentially an open air concentration camp, right? So it's unfathomable for anyone living in the 21st century who actually reads anything to understand why would anyone defend those politics. I don't care if you're right or left, but that's where we are.
Yeah.
And then the way that AIPAC did it was so dishonest. They hardly raised the question of Israel. What they did was they basically distorted Cori Bush's record on certain positions that she took. Same thing with Jamal Bowman. They talked about Israel, but they talked about other things and distorted the record to make it seem as though he's not a good representative of the district. And that money could have been used for other things, but we know what it was used for. For AIPAC or for the ADL, for example, Anti-Defamation League, or any of these organizations that claim that they are liberal, democratic, is just a bold-faced lie. They are part of the machinery that fuels the very fascism that we've been talking about. I watched and this is kind of connecting to the campus politics. I mean, we at UCLA watched as white supremacists, self-declared Nazis, and Zionists stood shoulder to shoulder to beat up our students and our colleagues who developed a nonviolent Palestine solidarity encampment. The fact that these are the alliances for the 21st century, they're not new, but they've escalated. What that means is that AIPAC is doing the bidding of trying to get Donald Trump elected. Let's just be clear about that.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to say that, but that's what's happening. And so right now, as we enter the first week of the Democratic National Convention, and as the Harris-Walz ticket moves increasingly toward no criticism of Israel, the continuation of our military and material arrangement with Israel, the fact that they're going to have American families of hostages in Gaza speak, and that the only one representing what might be seen as a pro-Palestinian, or at least in this case, a Muslim position is Keith Ellison. They're not bringing members of Jewish Voice for Peace.
Who's Keith Ellison for people that don't know?
Oh, right. So Keith Ellison was very high up in the Democratic Party for Minnesota. He became Attorney General in Minnesota. He was also a representative. He was the first, as far as I know, the first openly Muslim representative elected to the House.
Yep.
So he's amazing. He's a brilliant legal mind. He's a terrific ally, but he's supposed to represent, if not an opposition, certainly a kind of concession to the uncommitted movement. And of course, that's not going to work because there will be protests, there will be opposition, and I think we need to support that. But it's going to be iffy, and we're going to have to face this question. How much support do we give the Harris-Walz campaign, knowing that it looks like it's going to be business as usual in terms of U.S. policy toward Israel?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, folks are down in Chicago, and I encourage people, I encourage y'all to look at 1968 and what happened when people from around this country went to Chicago to protest the DNC at that time, and also Fannie Lou Hamer was there, and Lyndon B. Johnson was like, I'm out, like once, like Biden, one term, I'm out of here. Because at that time, I do feel that period was a period where all these young people, now elders, were like, we going hard. Like, we need to stop American imperialism. Right. We might have to go underground. And a lot depends also on social media and phones. Like, people in the 60s went underground because nobody could trace them. Like, now that doesn't even exist. Well, maybe there's an underground that we don't know about, So look, I'm always like, yes, do y'all, but I don't think it will make a difference. I mean, how is it going to make a difference? Because last week, this administration gave $20 billion more.
Right.
Like, and one thing I've been saying, I don't understand how for a year you could be ceasefire, the people of Palestine, children are being blown apart, then the last 2 weeks, and still be like, yo, Harris is it. Then the flip side of me is like, listen, most people in this country would be like, at least she's better than that dude. And when you listen to some of her policies, especially around housing, that's important, because I also think, like, I think this is kind of like a misstep in the movement. We're kind of hesitant to talk about the economy and things, right? Like, you're going to a conference and everybody's dealing with inflation, but you're not going to talk about it. But then yet all of us, like, everything has doubled. So that dear of inflation and what that means for us trying to raise our families and all of that. But do you think, well, look, If he wins, what do you think will happen? If he doesn't win, what do you think will happen?
Well, I think whether he wins or not, we're going to be dealing with I think immense violence,
Mm,
no matter what, and we have to be prepared for that. And it's hard to be prepared for that, given the fact that in our life, in yours and my lifetime, what do we spend most of our time doing? Fighting the police. And so that's not going to improve in terms of safety and protection. So either way, there's going to be right. But that's just the bottom line. That doesn't talk about the political implications, broadly speaking. Um, I think that if he wins, um, if it's not uh, through chicanery, trickery, you know, illegal actions, if it's a legitimate win, then we're doomed. We're doomed not just because of Trump's policies, because we know what's going to happen. I mean, Trump would basically try to implement um, Project 2025, and we know what that's about. It's not even a new idea. These ideas in Project 2025 have been around for a long time. They're just
So,
being
folks,
consolidated.
what Robin is alluding to is the 2025 project. I downloaded it. It was 900 pages. I
Hmm.
spent days reading it. And then all I could say is, thank God I'm in Black Studies, because there was the Heritage Foundation.
Right.
And the Heritage Foundation had already set a lot of the policies in this 2025. We also have and I encourage y'all to read The Contract for America by Newt Gingrich, just to say,
Right.
like, we people are astounded about 2025. They talked about this 40 years ago. And one
Right.
of the main things that they did was the culture wars. But what they did really in education, they ran hundreds of candidates to be on the board of their local high schools, right? So then you're seeing these things in high
Hmm.
schools like culture wars. Culture wars, they weren't about like banning books where they are now, but they were very smart and strategic. And I think this is a difference just on, a little bit more on the electoral political thing. It's like the
Right.
Republicans will go down swinging, saying that never happened. We didn't do that. While the Democrats are like, well, what else can we do? It's better. And I'm not,
Right.
I think I also understand, like, a lot of us, we have an enormous sense of privilege. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean that what we're saying is wrong. It's
Right.
here. They're not lying about. So what you're saying, either way, we're already living in this thing where there's going to be people that are going to ride hard for him.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And that's the scary part. But it's so funny. You mentioned the contract for America. We used to call it, as you remember, the contract on America. You
Right.
know, that's that's how we refer to it. But the language is similar. One of the things that you pointed out, which I think you have to always be reminded of, is that the only reason we got to this point and got to the fact that 44 states have passed some form of laws against teaching about race, gender, sexuality, critical race theory, is because throughout this whole period, the right has been mobilizing locally and has been gaining control of state legislatures. And the
Right.
fact, and so, I mean, whoever's president, they got to deal with that, you know, with the redistricting, with the gerrymandering, with the creation of a kind of uneven political power on the part of the right, and the ongoing disfranchisement of especially us, through voter suppression and things like that, and let alone all the money flowing into these electoral campaigns. So it's not like we live in a real democracy. But to go back to this question of fascism, and also the point you raised, which I think is very important too, the economy. How do we think about the economy? Um, Fascism thrives oftentimes on people being able to hold contradictions in their heads,
Mm,
you know, And one of the big contradiction is they could say, as poor people, as working people, right? We are starving. Prices of things are going up. Um, we we don't have medical care. We can't pay our bills, and still support policies that strip states of any federal support for medical care, that that basically make it impossible to increase the minimum wage, that strips away subsidies for housing, that destroy the environment, all the things that people are complaining about. They'll support the policies to take those away because they think either someone else is going to get it,
Right.
like these other Negroes and Mexicans and stuff, they're going to get all that stuff, or that somehow it's a threat to their freedom. So the contradictions, the fact that they could hold these contradictions, is something that we have to come to terms with, because when we think about the economy, if we don't think more sophisticatedly about the economy, if we don't talk about economics, then what happens is the Wall Street Journal runs these editorials that say the worst thing that could happen is putting limits on big business. So when Kamala Harris says, we're going to stop price gouging, that sort of thing, and like that's the worst thing that could happen. What is
Right.
price gouging? Price gouging means it's price gouging to respond to price gouging. Basically means that you could put top limits on the cost of basic needs. We used to call that, uh, well, the Nixon administration did the same thing. Where you would actually say there's a cap on the cost of basic goods. However, what we've been witnessing over the last 40 years is a cap on wages and allowing prices to go up to wherever they were going to go up to. And so it's not that long ago in the United States that certain kinds of commodities were subsidized. The problem is that they're still being subsidized in agriculture, but for the benefit of big farms, let alone big pharma, but big industrial agriculture. So they get the subsidy, but it doesn't translate to us
Yeah.
as consumers. And free trade policies, NAFTA being one of the most important kind of roadmaps or blueprints,
And
have
so
also
that's NAFTA
affected
was
the
the North American Free Trade.
trade agreement.
Yeah, and it was it was started well by Bill Clinton when he was president, and
Mhm.
we're still seeing the effects of that almost 25 years later.
Exactly. And it's an example, free trade agreements have actually had an impact on, in terms of businesses going to other countries to find cheaper labor, or environmental regulations that are not as stringent. Uh, it has caused greater poverty among farmers and manufacturing workers in the global South. It has had an impact on the price of things, and also the impact on employment in the global North, in this case, the United States. So these things are negative examples, negative outcomes of free trade. Meanwhile, again, we go back to the Wall Street Journal, the CNN, to all the mainstream outlets that will say what we need are more free trade policies. What we need is less regulation on business. What we need is no regulation when it comes to things like wages and working conditions. So when you raise those things, when the Harris-Walz campaign raises these as like ways to fix them, you got the right coming out speaking on behalf of rational economics, and the rest of us are just sort of like, what does that mean? Maybe they're right. And that's the thing I worry about. That we have to think about what would be of an effective economic policy, especially in the age of capitalism.
Yeah, so with that, Robert, could you talk about racial capitalism? Like, because I have so many young folks and realizing like, well, you got to like break this down. But you're so well adept at breaking that down. Can you talk about what racial capitalism actually means?
Right. Yeah, it's for me at least, it simply is an acknowledgement that capitalism as a system is not racially or gendered neutral. You know, in other words, one of the ways in which uh, value is determined and wealth is accumulated is through racial difference. It's very simple. It's not an accident. I mean, you could see racial capitalism by just going into any restaurant and seeing who's like the racial divisions between
Yeah.
who's cooking, who's serving.
Like, and who's making everything happen behind the curtain? Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, the best example I could think of is like you go to a sushi restaurant, and you got like the sushi chefs. They're
Yeah.
like they're in front, all Japanese. Some are Korean, but you wouldn't know that. And they're making the sushi, and then you pull back the curtain. There's nothing but Latinx workers. You
Yeah.
know, you look at the issue of security. Who are security guards? Low wage security guards tend to be black men and black women,
Yeah.
black and brown people, and others who actually have jobs where there are better wages and higher working conditions, better working conditions and better benefits, tend not to be people of color. So all that's to say, it's not an accident. It has nothing to do with skill. It has to do with the way in which race is leveraged to determine who gets better things. And it's not because they necessarily hate black people, although they might, that might be true. But I tell you one thing, you can make a lot of money, you can make a lot more money by uh, by investing in so-called blighted communities, by using blight, the adjective blight, right, as a way to say that these are low income, poor, undeveloped communities, and then because the real estate is cheap, to go in or use eminent domain to take that stuff and build things, or slumlords, for example, can make a lot more money oppressing, exploiting renters of color than they're going to do come into Bel Air or some expensive place, right? So in some ways, even groceries, even something as basic as groceries, everyone knows that the kind of uh, produce and other kinds of products that you find in poor urban communities is not as nice as what you find in some suburbs and other high income communities, which is why people will get on the subway to go someplace else to shop,
The shop. Yeah.
in New York. So that's how racial capitalism works.
So I want to get to the report that you were part of, the UCLA task force on anti-Palestinian, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism, the militarization of campus. So, I'm not sure if people know the whole story about UCLA. I feel there's at least enough people that, like, we saw what happened was very different
Mm-hmm.
of what went down specifically in UCLA. So there was a task force. You were part of it. Other folks were part of it. And I was going to read this part of it.
Okay.
As our task force understood from its inception, there's more at stake than academic freedom. The Palestine Solidarity Encampment, along with other actions, rallies, teachings, and the like, have never wavered from the core issue: the killing, maiming, starving, and displacing of Palestinian people in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as in Gaza. Our Arab and Muslim communities and anyone subjected to discrimination, repression, and militarization of our campus, the persistent attacks on students, faculty, and staff for supporting ceasefire, divestment, disclosure, the punitive measures deployed by the administration toward anyone even mildly critical of Israeli
Mm-hmm.
policies have made UCLA less safe than ever for Palestinian, Arab, Muslim students and faculty. So the report is out. It's about 15 pages, but I mean, talking about both of these with you have always been staunchly, you've been there, you've been writing about it for decades, like Angela Davis, about what's going on in Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And then here you are, where you are a history professor and you were privy on a right there to see what was going down. So if you could tell people what did go down at on those couple of days, and then what are going to be the recommendations. As we now know, pretty much in the next week, students are coming back, and I
Right,
highly do not think they're going to stop doing what they're doing. You know, and
right.
that in academia, it's not. I mean, the attack and you know, a lot of us in it, like this is not supposed to be happening in academia, but it is. I also just find it a little nuance interesting that three women took the brunt and quit their jobs as presidents of the universities, but no men did, no white men.
Hmm.
And I was like,
Right.
this is fascinating. So you bring in three women, one sister, two other, they're all resigned. Either they were told, like, leave now, or they were being trolled and attacked, where people are literally leaking out where their children go to school, where they work, where their partners are. They were like, no. And the latest one was in Colombia 2 days ago. She's
Hmm.
like, I'm out.
Right, right,
We're in the thick of things with the as a professor, administrator, and a supporter of students on that campus that were met with, it could have been deadly. That amount of
right.
violence, when you see it, somebody could have gotten killed. One of your students could have died.
Yes, yes. And almost did. Um, yeah, so in a nutshell, I should say that what has been going on at UCLA has been going on even when I got to that campus in 2011. That is that the Students for Justice in Palestine have been under attack from the upper administration, specifically Chancellor Gene Block, who recently stepped down from his post, not because of any of this. He was planning to step down anyway. Um, and so what happened over the years is that more and more students and colleagues came to see that the attacks on SJP were pretty much unwarranted, that with every single war in Gaza and the ongoing violence in the West Bank, that Israel actually needed to be held to account. And so as SJP grew, as the Jewish Voice for Peace actually started uh, a chapter on UCLA's campus. I was one of the advisors. Um, as more and more people began to speak out, uh, it became a very tense environment because there were a few, not the majority, of Zionist students who felt like the presence of SJP itself, the presence of any criticism of Israel, made them unsafe. When October 7th happened, all those contradictions came to a head. And so UCLA was unique in that we had a very vocal, uh, deep, deeply committed Zionist presence on campus, especially in the medical school in South Campus, among those who don't actually teach students. Uh,
Mm.
and then and then they had ties to a community, a larger community in West LA and elsewhere, that were strong, staunch Zionists. So many of the students who are involved in our protests were themselves Jewish students, anti-Zionist Jewish students. So talk about those few days. Uh, Basically, I think it was April 24th, 25th. The students decide to create their own solidarity encampment. Many of those, it was a multiracial group of students across the board, with Black, Brown, Arab, Muslim, Christian, a lot of Jewish students. They developed this encampment. It was the most beautiful thing. People were actually reading, studying. They were doing more study. They were doing more. They were getting more education in encampments than
Then
in
they,
the classroom.
yeah,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I was teaching a class called Cop Cities at the time, which
uh-huh.
coincidentally, and so Cop Cities became about the university, and so part of it was taking place in the encampment, in an indirect and direct way. So, in a nutshell, when that happened, the university essentially invited Zionists from the outside to, with money, like Jerry Seinfeld and his wife, who put up a lot of the money to
Mm.
pay for this huge jumbotron, this huge, giant, big screen TV, which they were permitted to place at the edge of the encampment. Now you've been involved in protests your whole life. You know that no one would put the counter protesters right next to
Right.
the protests. But
Right.
this was deliberate. This was deliberate. And they set this up, and this jumbotron was playing like traumatizing sounds of gunshots, of explicit descriptions of rape. Um, they were, repeating a lot of propaganda of the post October 7th, or what happened, and it was subjecting not just the encampment but all students on campus to
To
this
that.
kind of propaganda.
Wait,
They
so who actually let that happen? Was it okayed by security or the chancellor?
it was the top. See, no one wants to take responsibility. We found out later that they never had a permit. They never got a permit to do it, but the university
Right.
administration allowed it.
Okay.
And that's everyone, security, the vice chancellor, the chancellor, and they permitted. So it was supposed to be there for one day for a demonstration, and they kept it there. Now, why is this important? It's important because evidence suggests that the administration was hoping that the kinds of attacks from the community would basically break up the encampment so they wouldn't have to call the police and so they wouldn't have to look bad. Because the optics of the police beating up people versus, say, the community beating up people,
Right.
they miscalculated.
Yeah.
So the two really important nights, not just these are not the only important nights, but the many of them, was one night when, again, Klansmen, Nazis, white nationalists showed up with pipes, sticks, uh, um, bear spray,
Very-
like
Yeah. Yeah.
um, alongside Zionists who had the same weapons, and they were beaten in attacking our students who actually had been trained in non-escalation tactics, and they were not responding. They were protecting themselves, but they were not like throwing stuff back at them. They actually did an amazing job of holding on to the space, and a lot of them were hospitalized because they got sprayed in the eyes. There were people running with saline solution to try to
And
clear
like
out the eye.
what you said, one student almost died, right?
Yes, I think more than one almost died. I mean,
Mm,
I
yeah.
I saw this one girl later, a young white girl. I think she was a second year, and her head was cracked, like you could see the seams where her,
My God.
because they were throwing bricks, they were throwing all kinds of things at them, and these are young people, many of whom have never been involved in protests,
I mean, yeah,
never.
let's just say that UCLA is not a community college or state college, not in a bad way. These are
Right,
students that, for the most part, these white students have grown up in privilege. These things don't ever happen in their community or their town. Now they're here. And then
right,
they're like, parents are like, why are you attacking them? Really being like, why are you attacking my daughter who's white? And it's like, no, they're attacking anybody that's going to be supportive of the efforts to end the annihilation of people
right.
in a community. Because, like, that's the first time, and that's what they're facing.
Exactly, exactly. So imagine this happens for 3 hours. The police are lined up watching the whole thing, and they never intervene.
Like
Um, they,
Charlottesville.
yeah, like
Yeah.
Charlottesville. Not only that, but they're high fiving this one Zionist student who's running for office. He's high fiving the police, um, and and I should add one other thing, which is important because recently there was a court case, a decision on the part of I guess it was a California Superior Court that ruled that the UCLA protest in UCLA has no right to block Jewish students from going to class. This is based on a falsehood.
Right.
No Jewish student was blocked from going to class.
Yeah.
That did not happen. They made these fake videos because they wanted to pass through the encampment, and the encampment people were like, no, just go around. And they used the video as a way to make it seem as though students couldn't get into class. The only time students couldn't enter certain entrances of buildings had nothing to do with the protesters. It had to do with security. Security
Mhm.
said you can't come, so you got to go around. And yet, so you have a ruling against something that never happened. Which I just, I never thought I'd ever see the day when these things would happen. And so basically, in a nutshell, after the 3 hours were up, they watched these young people beat students and let them go and said, bye, we'll let you go. The next night, that's when the chancellor said, we're going to clear the encampment, called the police, and that's when they began shooting students point blank with rubber bullets and beating them and destroying the encampment. And I remember I went to get some of the kids out of jail the next morning, and there was one young sister who was stabbed in the leg, by one of these so-called counter protesters. Nothing happened to the person. And only now we're using like crowdsourcing from thousands of hours of video that captures everything.
Right.
And the one last thing I should say is that while all this is happening, our students, the ones who were arrested, were being brought up on disciplinary charges by the university
Yeah.
as if they did something wrong. And it's a travesty. So it's it's going to be interesting what happens in the coming year, because we have a new chancellor coming into office. We have an African American vice chancellor who's now the acting chancellor, who I should say did not do a very good job of protecting our students. We have a new campus security regime headed by a former police chief from Sacramento who has a checkered record in terms of how he dealt with police violence. And so our campus is a police state. We got 3 different security companies with employees all over campus, plus police everywhere. And it's not safe. It is the opposite of safe.
Yeah. We now know we're seeing so many people lose their jobs, whether they have tenure or not. We're seeing what's going on in Florida. Like one day you have a job, the next day they shut down every DI and 25 people are
Mm-hmm.
gone. And I'm going to say this super personally. When I was an undergraduate here, where I live now at University of Albany, New York, I live here. I was
Mm-hmm.
super blessed to have Dr. Vivian Gordon take me under her wing. We were also at that time in the early 1990s. We're coming off previous struggles around anti-apartheid. Then
Right.
we're in the 90s with Bill Clinton, the juvenile justice. The whole point being is at that time, especially in New York State, Black student unions were hard, like rolling like 500 deep, right? So one day I found out who I was. Next time somebody was like, run, then I become president of the Black Albany State University Black Alliance. And those of us, those folks that are always asking me about Afro Latinx, Black Latinx, what I will say, like I said earlier, I became the president of the Black Student Union, and it was the Latino administrators that called me into an office to say, you can't be Black and Puerto Rican, pick a side. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to pick the Black side. And this was in the 90s. But
Mm-hmm.
for years, Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael,
Mm-hmm.
created the All African People's Revolutionary Party, right? So for years, Kwame would be going to campuses all the time. He came up here. He was supposed to come back. And basically the president at that time, Patrick Swaggart, who ended up becoming the president of Howard, basically was making a deal with the Israeli Education Commission or something where they would be an outpost of the University of Albany. Folks, remember, I'm talking about 1993. No social media, thank God. But
Mm-hmm.
basically, they told us we couldn't bring him. We did it. It took a week. We sneaked them onto campus. They thought we were just having a big meeting with 500 people. And I was just like, basically, like, yo, this is messed up. Like, we're in academia. Everything I learned here is about free expression and us, being able to debate all these things. And the administration doesn't want us, they stopped us from trying to bring in Kwame Ture. And then he came out of doors because what we did as a student group is we got close to the custodians that had all the keys where we
Right.
literally sneaked them onto campus. I pretended it was bad. And then to this day, I just like, holy crap, we did this. He does his thing. Then at the end of the night, the vice president of student affairs, it's like all black people were like, yeah, you're going to get expelled. And that's what happened to me. But
Mm,
while the judicial process was happening, my house got broken into with like a brick, like, you're against Zionism, we're against you. And then as I was dealing with potentially being expelled, but luckily all the professors, everybody like rallied for me. I almost got hit by a car and somebody was with,
mm,
and that brother was like, yo, I think they're trying to kill you. And I was like, who's they? And he's like, the Zionists. I was like, why? Like, I'm just, because there was nothing to even suggest that I, in the inkling of like that type of power. So I have found it very difficult for me to see all the stories about student groups disbanding this group, because even at that time that never happened. They tried,
right,
they tried to expel me. Dr. Gordon and everybody in Black Studies was like, you don't want to do that, let's just end this right here. But personally, when I have to deal with certain issues, I got to think about it like, whoa, because there's trauma from that happening. But it's also like, one thing that many of us who are professors is that we get tenure, and that just means we can do our work and challenge students and not be questioned. And now we're in a space where it's in academia that a lot of people are taking the hits. So you have the report, you're a professor there,
hmm,
everybody's coming back. What do you think this semester looks like at this moment
right,
around
right.
the country, around the country?
Right, right. Well, just before I answer that question, two real quick things. One, you're right. The repression that the students and faculty and staff, because we have staff actually involved in some of these things, is greater than what we experience. I think it's different. Now, of course, someone trying to kill you is is repression at the highest level, and I believe it because I know of other instances like that. And it's lucky that you got out of
And
that
let me just say
alive.
this real quick on that point.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't born in the movement, fam. I came up in the movement.
Mm-hmm.
So as we're studying specifically the civil rights movement and seeing this footage, that brother that was with me, because I said for weeks, I was like, that wasn't for me. He's like, listen, it's not about you. It's about us. It's
Right.
about how strong we are in the Black Student Union. It's about how much we're demanding. But because you went, he said, you went against Zionism, this will probably happen to you in the future. And I was like, well, not like I didn't sign up for this. I was like, oh God, okay. Like, I actually am happy he was there, because I didn't know at one point. It's like, did this happen? And he was like, no. And I was like, why me in Albany, New York? He's like, because that's what they do. It's a system
Right.
of eradication. That's what he
Right.
taught me. Yes, sorry. So,
Right, right, yeah, and it's people may say, "Oh, this is all conspiracy theory," but we have evidence. The evidence is that if you just look at the history of the Anti-Defamation League and the role that it played in spying on various organizations, from Black student unions to MECHA to the African National Congress to
right.
the files are there. It's like you don't have to make it up. Look it up yourself.
Yeah.
It's there. How could an organization that claims to be a civil rights organization spend its resources spying on other organizations that are civil rights organizations, right? So we know what's there. But the other thing I just have to say, which is because I know our time's about to
Yeah.
end on a positive note, is that despite all this repression, and I could speak to my colleagues at UCLA, I have the best colleagues. We have so many faculty who have stood up. Many of them are not tenured. Many of them are quite vulnerable, and they
Right.
have been incredibly courageous. The solidarity in our Faculty for Justice in Palestine is unprecedented and unparalleled. I mean, I can't even, if I sat here and just named all the people, which I can't do for their own protection, we'd be here till tomorrow. So we run deep, and that's something I've in doing this work for the last almost 40 years, I've never seen this level of solidarity, this level of faculty. The
Word.
sec,
Yeah.
and then the other thing is that all over the country, it's usually, and my daughter's an example of this, uh, untenured women of color, queer, femme, who are actually at the forefront of standing up to these things. So just as these women presidents have been forced to step down, and I actually think that they should have.
Right. You're like, yeah.
But so should everyone else. I mean,
It's that
chance
contradiction. Like they should have stepped
exactly,
down, but also why is it all women?
exactly. So in other words, our chancellor Block should have been the first one to say, you know what, I totally screwed up, or he should have been fired. But that's not actually what happened. But the point is that it's amazing how the image, the kind of popular Zionist image of these protests are racist. Look at the memes, racist, big, gigantic Arab terrorists are the ones organizing these protests. But if you actually look and you pay attention, even to who goes to university, it's like
Right.
mostly women. It's like
Right.
my classes are like, sometimes 70% women, femme, trans, and they're the ones that are like taking the boldest stance, right? And risking everything in doing so. And we have to hold them up and support them and kind of rethink all this stuff. Because if you have tenure and you're a faculty member and you really believe in the stuff you teach and you're not standing up for justice, then you need to step down.
Yes, always close out. Like, what's a couple of things that, whether you're in quote academia or you're organizing in the streets, like what are a couple things that we should be clear on, and one or two suggestions around, you know, we get wins in the movement. It's not a lot, but I also think every opportunity could be a win. So, what are a couple of things you would say to folks that are listening to you for the first time?
Right. Well, one, and this goes back to the question I never answered, that is what's going to happen on campus, is that we have to continue to center the war on Gaza, the war on the West Bank, the war in Palestine, and cannot let that rest. Because with each and every day, someone is dying, sometimes dozens are dying. And could you imagine if we can't get a ceasefire,
Yeah.
who else is going to die? So this is an urgent matter that cannot go away. Number one. Number two, I think we always just have to keep our eyes and ears sensitive to the fact that fascism is not something that only manifests itself in the state. It's around us. It's in the culture. We need to combat it. Sometimes it's within us, you know. But we need to combat it everywhere. We need to combat it at the level of the state, at the level of culture, and realize that even after, Kamala Harris is anointed as the next symbol of whatever, we cannot let our guard down because they're not prepared to resist fascism. They're prepared to what's called appeasement.
Mm.
And appeasement has been the democratic way, and we cannot accept that. We need to do better.
Yeah, so first and foremost, thank you for your time. Everybody follow Robin, incredible work, his Boston Globe editorials and everything. I'm so lucky and blessed every time I'm with him. Because I think for me, or so many of us in the movement, you just are always there with love. Even if it's a critique, it's just love. And it's all right for us to kind of grapple with these things. And I think it's important for a lot of folks that are watching now that are beginning their careers that all this is also being what's happening now is Black studies is being attacked,
Mhm.
ethnic
Right.
studies, women's studies. And if you look at the history of Black studies, folks, that was an in out strategy that had this. But right now, the brunt, and kind of seeing all the attacks on DEI is like, people. It's not just something that's you think about
Right.
happening every day. So I'm always blessed to be in space with you. And we'll be watching well, you might not, but yeah. I'll be watching it tonight and highlighting those contradiction. So I'm super happy that you could be my first guest on here. And I
Well,
love
I appreciate it. I have to say this before I go, which is that, people need to support you. You've been doing this work as an independent radical journalist since, almost since, well, certainly since I've known you. And you came on the scene for a long time ago. And if people who watch this don't support you materially, financially, then it's hard to do this work. So I'm really appealing to all your listeners and all the ones watching you that there's no voice like Rosa Clemente. I'm telling you, you have never, ever wavered from the truth in facing it, no matter what the consequences. So, that's why it's hard. But only good things happen that are hard.
that's no, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Anybody you want me to keep doing the show, cash at me. But yes. I mean, but also because I know you and Dr. Vega and Dr. Boyan, and again, in Black Studies, we're losing all the elders. We lost two in my department,
Hmm.
lost Turner, and now Bracy and Strickland.
Right.
And if you really dig deep, especially around Black studies, you will understand there would have been no other studies, no other if it wasn't Black studies. So thank you. I love you. Let's see what happens in the next 60 days,
Yeah,
70.
we'll see.
We'll see.
Thank
And
you, Rosa, as always.
time. Love you, man.
Okay, love you too.
Blessings. Hey, everybody. Thank you for rocking with me. I'm going to do what I did in the Republican Party and watch the next 3 days and keep bringing on dope guests. So I'm calling them pop-up shows. So my guests, wherever they are, can pick a day or time that's best for them. And then I'll come on here live. Also, I encourage you to follow on the protests going on. Yesterday, I had Sherry Honkala, who has been for 4 decades about poor people's economics. And I interviewed her yesterday on the streets of Chicago. So yeah, let's watch, let's be engaged, support a group, a person, and all that. I'll be back. I may be back later on if one of my guests that I asked is like, I can do it tonight. But there's going to be a whole lot of dope guests these next 5 days. So thank you for rocking with me and your support. I appreciate you all. Oh my God. What?